Really need to get a better gaffer or lighter. Best boy in here. I'm never good with lighting. Anyway, I believe right now we're still talking about how stupid Dr. Goldsmith is. You'll recall he thought he could do better jumping than a puppet in a movie, or a play rather, and actually hurt himself demonstrating that he could. He, I'm afraid, had no settled system of any sort, so that his conduct must not be strictly scrutinized. But his affections were social and generous, and when he had money he gave it away very liberally. His desire of imaginary consequence predominated over his attention to truth. When he began to rise into notice, he said he had a brother who was Dean of Durham, a fiction so easily detected that it is wonderful how he should have been so inconsiderate as to hazard it. I am willing to hope that there may have been some mistake as to this anecdote, though I had it from a dignitary of the church, probably Bishop Percy, says later footnote. Dr. Isaac Goldsmith, his near relation, was Dean of Cloyne in 1747. He boasted to me at this time of the power of his pen in commanding money, which I believe was true in a certain degree, though in the instance he gave he was by no means correct. He told me that he had sold a novel for £400. This was his Vicar of Wakefield. But Johnson informed me that he had made the bargain for Goldsmith, and the price was £60. That's a big difference. And, sir, said Johnson, a sufficient price too when it was sold, for then the fame of Goldsmith had not been elevated, as it afterwards was, by his traveller, and the bookseller had such a faint hope of profit by his bargain that he kept the manuscript by him a long time, and did not publish it till after the traveller had appeared. Then, to be sure, it was accidentally worth more money. Mrs. Piozzi and Sir John Hawkins, in their previous books, the Anecdotes of Johnson and Life of Johnson, those pieces of shit, have strangely misstated the history of Goldsmith's situation and Johnson's friendly interference when this novel was sold. I shall give it authentically from Johnson's own exact narration. Quoting Johnson here. I received one morning a message from poor Goldsmith that he was in great distress, and as it was not in his power to come to me, begging that I would come to him as soon as possible. I sent him a guinea, and promised to come to him directly. I accordingly went as soon as I was dressed, and found that his landlady had arrested him for his rent, at which he was in violent passion. I perceived that he had already changed my guinea, and had got a bottle of Madeira and wine before him. I'm sorry. A bottle of Madeira in a glass before him. Madeira's a cheap wine popular in these regions that I often like myself. I put the cork into the bottle, desired he would be calm, and began to talk to him of the means by which he might be extricated. He then told me that he had a novel ready for the press, which he produced to me. I looked into it and saw its merit, told the landlady I should have soon return, and having gone to a bookseller, sold it for £60. I brought Goldsmith the money, and he discharged his rent, not without rating his landlady in a high tone for having used him so ill. End of quoted part. It may not be improper to annex here Mrs. Piozzi's account of this transaction in her own words, as specimen of the extreme inaccuracy with which all her anecdotes of Dr. Johnson were related, or rather discolored and distorted. Here's her quoted part of the same incident. I have forgotten the year, but it could... Sorry, I'll stop doing that. I have forgotten the year, but it could scarcely, I think, be later than 1756, 1765 rather, or 1766, that he was called abruptly from our house after dinner, and returned in about 3 hours. Said he had been with an enraged author whose landlady pressed him for payment within doors, while the bailiffs beset him without. That he was drinking himself drunk with Madeira to drown care, and fretting over a novel which, when finished, was to be his whole fortune. But he could not get it done for distraction, nor could he step out of doors to offer it for sale. Mr. Johnson, therefore, sent away the bottle, and went to the bookseller, recommending the performance and desiring some immediate relief, which when he brought back to the writer, he called the women of the house directly to partake of punch, and passed their time in merriment. Oh, I kind of like that version better, actually. Whatever. Boswell here. My next meeting with Johnson was on Friday, the 1st of July, when he and I and Dr. Goldsmith supped together at the Mitre, or Mitre, M-I-T-R-E. I was before this time pretty well acquainted with Goldsmith, who was one of the brightest ornaments of the Johnson school. It's kind of like Warhol's factory, I guess. Goldsmith's respectful attachment to Johnson was then at its height, for his own literary reputation had not yet distinguished him so much as to excite a vain desire of competition with his great, M, master. He had increased my admiration of the goodness of Johnson's heart by incidental remarks in the course of conversation, such as when I mentioned Mr. Levitt, whom he entertained under his roof. He is poor and honest, which is recommendation enough to Johnson. And when I wondered that he was very kind to a man of whom I had heard a very bad character, he is now become miserable, and this ensures the protection of Johnson. Goldsmith attempted this evening to maintain, I suppose from an affectation of paradox, that knowledge was not desirable on its own account, for it often was a source of unhappiness. To which Johnson said, "Why, sir, that knowledge may in some cases produce unhappiness, I allow. But upon the whole, knowledge per se is certainly not an object which every man would wish to attain, although perhaps he may not take the trouble necessary for attaining it." I think we've heard this quote before, haven't we? Dr. John Campbell, I'm assuming not the writer of what is that? The Man of the Mask of a Thousand, Hero of a Thousand Faces? Isn't that John Campbell? No, this is Dr. John Campbell, the celebrated political and biographical writer. Being mentioned, Johnson said, "Campbell is a man of much knowledge and has a good share of imagination. His Hermippus Rendivivus is very entertaining as an account of the Hermetic philosophy, and as furnishing a curious history of the extravagances of the human mind. If it were merely imaginary, it would be nothing at all. Campbell is not always rigidly careful of truth in his conversation, but I do not believe there is any thing of the carelessness of his books. Campbell is a good man, a pious man. I am afraid he has not been in the inside of a church for many years. But he never passes a church without pulling off his hat. This shows that he has good principles. I used to go pretty often to Campbell's on a Sunday evening, till I began to consider that the shoals of Scotchmen, who flocked about him, might probably say, when anything of mine was all well done, 'Aye, aye, he has learned this of Cormel,' meaning, I suppose, Campbell." Footnote here, from Boswell. I am inclined to think that Johnson was misinformed as to the circumstance of Campbell not going to church. I own I am jealous for my worthy friend Dr. John Campbell. For though Milton could without remorse absent himself from public worship, I cannot. On the contrary, I have the same habitual impressions upon my mind with those of a truly venerable judge who said to Mr. Langton, "Friend Langton, if I have not been at church on Sunday, I do not feel myself easy." Dr. Campbell was a sincerely religious man. Lord Macartney, who was eminent for his variety of knowledge and attention to men of talents, and knew him well, told me that when he called on him in a morning, he found him reading a chapter in the Greek New Testament, which he informed his lordship was in constant practice. The quantity of Dr. Campbell's composition is almost incredible, and his labors brought him large profits. Dr. Joseph Warden told me that Johnson said of him, "He is the richest author that ever grazed the common of literature." Next sentence begins, "He talked very contemptuously." I'm guessing we're talking about Johnson, but it might also be Dr. Goldsmith. We'll see through the context of this. "He talked very contemptuously of Churchill's poetry, observing that it had a temporary currency only from the audacity of abuse in being filled with living names, and that it would sink into oblivion." So that was Dr. Goldsmith's opinion. I, Boswell, ventured to hint that he was not quite a fair judge, as Churchill had attacked him violently. Oh, I'm sorry. Take that back. That was Johnson's opinion. Boswell's rebuff. Johnson counter rebuff. Johnson, "Nay, sir, I am a very fair judge. He did not attack me violently till he found I did not like his poetry. And his attack on me shall not prevent me from continuing to say what I think of him, from an apprehension that it may be ascribed to resentment. No, sir, I called the fellow a blockhead at first, and I will call him a blockhead still. However, I will acknowledge that I have a better opinion of him now than I once had, for he has shown more fertility than I expected. To be sure, he is a tree that cannot produce good fruit. He only bears crabs. But, sir, a tree that produces a great many crabs is better than a tree which produces only a few." That's fair. In this depreciation of Churchill's poetry, I, Boswell, could not agree with him. It is very true that the greatest part of it is upon the topics of the day, on which account, as it brought him great fame and profit at the time, it must proportionally slide out of the public attention as other occasional objects succeed. But Churchill had extraordinary vigor both of thought and expression. His portrayal of the players will ever be valuable to the true lover of the drama, and his strong caricatures of several eminent men of his age will not be forgotten by the curious. Let me add that there is also in his works many passages which are of a general nature, and his prophecy of famine is a poem of no ordinary merit. It is, indeed, falsely injurious to Scotland, but therefore may be allowed a greater share of invention. Bonnell Thornton had just published a burlesque ode on St. Cecilia's Day, adapted to the ancient British music, viz., the saltbox, the Jew's harps, the marrow bones and cleaver, the humstrum or hurdy-gurdy, and etc. Sounds terrible. Johnson praised its humor, and seemed much diverted with it. He repeated the following passage. "In strains more exalted the saltbox shall join, and clattering and battering and clapping combine." Join and combine, okay. "With a rap and a tap, while the hollow side sounds, up and down leaps the flaps, and with rattling rebounds." I'm guessing that's a song. I mentioned the periodical paper called the Connoisseur. Johnson said it wanted matter. No doubt it had not the deep thinking of Johnson's writings, but surely it had just views of the surface of life in a very sprightly manner. His opinion of the world was not much higher than that of the Connoisseur. Let me here apologize for the imperfect manner in which I am obliged to exhibit Johnson's conversation at this period. In the early part of my acquaintance with him, I was so wrapped in admiration of his extraordinary colloquial talents, and so little accustomed to his peculiar mode of expression, that I found it extremely difficult to recollect and record his conversation with its genuine vigor and vivacity. In progress of time, when my mind was, as it were, strongly impregnated with the Johnsonian ether, I would, with much more facility and exactness, carry in my memories and commit to paper the exuberant variety of his wisdom and wit. At this time, let me make sure I'm at the right page. Yes. At this time, Miss Williams, as she was then called, though she did not reside with him in the Temple under his roof, but had lodgings in Bold Court, Fleet Street, and so much of his attention that he every night drank tea with her before he went home, however late it might be, and she always set up for him. That's a weird sentence. I'm going to read that again. At this time, Miss Williams, as she was then called, though she did not reside with him in the Temple under his roof, but had lodgings in Bolt Court, Fleet Street, had so much of his attention that he every night drank tea with her before he went home, however late it might be, as she always set up for him. That's a little bitter. This, it may be fairly conjectured, was not alone a proof of his regard for her, but of his own unwillingness to go into solitude before that unreasonable hour at which he had habituated himself to expect the oblivion of repose. Dr. Goldsmith, being a privileged man, went with him that night, strutting away, and calling to me with an air of superiority, like that of an asterisk over an asterisk disciple of a sage of antiquity. Like that of an esoteric over an exoteric disciple of a sage of antiquity, I go to Miss Williams. I confess I then envied him this mighty privilege, of which he seemed so proud, but it was not long before I attained the same mark of distinction. On Tuesday, the 5th of July, I again visited Johnson. He told me he had looked into the poems of a pretty voluminous writer, Mr. now Dr. John Ogilvy, one of the Presbyterian ministers of Scotland, which had lately come out, but couldn't find no thinking in them. Boswell. Is there not imagination in them, sir? Johnson. Why, sir, there is in them what was imagination, but it is no more imagination in him than sound is sound in the echo. And his diction, too, is not his own. We have long ago seen white-robed innocents in flower-bespangled meads. Talking of London, Johnson observed, Sir, if you wish to have a just notion of the magnitude of the city, you must now not be satisfied with seeing its great streets and squares, but must survey the innumerable little lanes and courts. It is not in the showy evolutions of buildings, but in the multiplicity of human habitations which are crowded together, that the wonderful immensity of London consists. I have often amused myself with thinking how different a place London is to so different people. They, whose narrow minds are contracted to the consideration of some one particular pursuit, view it only through that medium. A politician thinks of it merely as a seat of government in its different departments. A grazier as a vast market for cattle. A mercantile man as a place where a prodigious deal of business is done upon change. A dramatic enthusiast as the grand scene of the theatrical entertainments. A man of pleasure as an assemblage of taverns, and the great emporium for ladies of easy virtue. But the intellectual man is struck with it, as comprehending the whole of human life in all its variety, the contemplation of which is inexhaustible. Well, that's it for today. Happy Thanksgiving, and bye from Boswell.